If there were a manual for life, the guy in me wouldn't follow it. Or maybe he would just try to rewrite it himself. I'm Andrea Leigh, and this is the Andrea Leigh Show. I felt like we had a very successful episode number 1. You heard my story. What you really heard was the response of my parents to my story, the response of my parents, the response of my colleagues, the response of clients, and later customers. Customers really weren't that big of an issue because they arrived after the fact. I didn't invite them into my transition journey. My story's not really one of transitioning. That's not who I am. It's an experience that I have had, and I am ready to talk about it. I've been ready for a while. I said at the beginning of last podcast, I had been wanting my show for a long time, and I had some hurdles to clear at first. So here we are. We're in episode number 2, and I am going to go over what amounts to some really crazy experiences and why you might find my story rather unique in the perspective I have, especially in the culture and the time we are in right now. This is a time where a lot of people think that transitioning and the subject matter of gender is polarizing. I'm not so sure. I know that we live in a world right now where identity politics has run amok, and the politics of division is fully in play. With me and my experience, I'm just not so sure that's the case, and that's why I think this podcast might be really interesting to move forward with, because my experience just isn't the case with what we see in the news and the news media all the time, whether it's in social media or whether it's on the nightly cable news, or the talking head shows, whatever that is. My experience just doesn't really bear out that the identity politics is really as polarizing as we are led to believe. Let's go back. Let me take you back before the subject matter of podcast episode number 1. About 25 years ago, I had just come out of a crazy, tumultuous divorce. It was really, really hellacious. And when it was all said and done, I had made a conscious decision that I wanted to live a life of experiences and not stuff, that I would acquire experiences and not spend my time accumulating more things to pile up in my home. 25 years later, I still have a lot of stuff. I've got quite a set of experiences behind me, and they're quite fun. Right after that marriage ended, I decided that I would take my daughter, I was a single parent at the time, and that we would do a lot of fun things. We would go to the U.S. Open, watch Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson play. Now, this is when they're both in their prime in the early 2000s. I would follow the Oklahoma Sooners on a hunt for a national championship, of which they did achieve in the year 2000. I took vacations with my daughter to SeaWorld, went to NASCAR races like the Texas 500. The company that I was working with at the time, we sponsored the NASCAR race and a NASCAR number 6 car at the Texas 500. And so I went and took clients to that, and that was quite an experience to actually be part of the car event down before the race. And that's what it looked like from 25 years ago. I just kept it going. I had a very successful career in the biopharm industry at the time. And we can talk about that industry in the future. I don't mind talking about my experience there and what I learned. I do like my time there. I was proud of my time there, but it did run its course by the time it was over, and that comes down to several years ago, and we can talk about that. I'm very happy to. The book has a lot of the details in there. My book, Do You Still Like Football? It's still on the bestseller list. I would encourage you to get that book. It's a special price for the ebook, and paperback and hardback are available. But I would really encourage you to get the book, and it will give you a little more in-depth idea of some of the stuff that we're talking about today in episode 2. I'd always wanted to get into the sport of triathlon and race the long distance races. It was something that I had wanted to do. I knew that it would take some work. I wanted to achieve something like that. I was always impressed with the amateur athletes that would go through the pain and suffering to cross that finish line, and I wanted that. It sounds funny why somebody would want that, but it is an amazing achievement. It's an amazing achievement to set out to accomplish. I did accomplish that twice. Not the Ironman. I did half Ironman races, so they took about half the time. But as a full-time parent and a full-time sales executive, that was going to be what I could work towards. It became much more personally impressive for me following a severe back injury I had in training for those races. Again, the book details some of those. Valentine's Day, that's when I was hurt, and then the recovery that followed just made the act of finishing the races that much more impressive to me personally. And that's really what I was set out to do, was to do that for myself. I did get a tremendous amount of support from my wife and my kids at the time. When my triathlon days were over after meeting my personal goals, I hung up the bike, never really getting it down to ride again or any meaningful rides or for any personal achievements. But what I did do was set out on a new venture, and that was to become certified in sustainable agriculture design. Now, that was an interesting time frame. I had moved from my achievements in the sport of triathlon to wanting to do something completely different, and that was to become certified in designing sustainable agriculture properties, raise my own food. That can be done on any kind of level, from a postage stamp backyard, even the deck of an apartment building if you were to live in the middle of a large metropolitan area, I suppose, to a large ranch, which is how I chose to implement the design myself personally on my own ranch. I bought a property outside of Norman, Oklahoma, and started to implement those design methods myself. That included planting a lot of native landscaping, native trees, native shrubbery, fruit-producing trees, planting an orchard, wanting to produce some of our own food. And it was some work. We also decided to graze cattle, and I had no experience doing that, but I did find somebody that would teach me those methods. Didn't want me to have any experience because they didn't want me to be prejudiced as any other way to raise cattle. It was going to be in a rotational grazing way. I found somebody that would teach me those methods. So after 4 days, I became a certified rotational grazing expert in how to rotationally graze cattle. That's not all that difficult when you're doing it on paper and you're learning to use some of the tools that it would take, but it's a hands-on deal. So I wouldn't really get my hands dirty until I came home and started moving my cow around. My one cow. I quickly got more cattle and started implementing those methods myself. And it was quite an experience. It was really great, actually. Ranching is hard work, and the animals are the least of one's worries typically. It's the fixing of fences, it's chasing after the cattle if they were to get out, it's caring for them in the winter, keeping them fed when the ground itself is possibly not producing as much feed as they would normally need year-round. That's the idea of rotational grazing, is you would move them around and let the ground recover and the vegetation recover to support them as they made their way back around to it several months later. But in the harshest of winters like Oklahoma, it can be fairly brutal, and you do have to sustain them with bringing in some outside sources. So we did that. When I look back at my adult life, and I had a nice career long before what I've started to describe here, I'd had a nice set of experiences. I had the experience of working for a large biopharmaceutical company, which the career would last about 3 decades, a little more. I had been personally successful in the sport of triathlon. I had now been certified in sustainable agriculture design and rotationally grazing my own cattle. It gives me a perspective that's very different than what other people have that have transitioned. Now, I find it humorous to look back at those times because what I haven't really said here a lot is that I was a very typical conservative, and I'm laughing now because I think God must have certainly been humored when I was so angry about the gender-neutral bathrooms that Target wanted to implement about 20 years ago, or a little long. I think God might have been rather humored in that I would be quite surprised with what he had in store for me over 20 years later. It gives me a varied perspective that a lot of people don't have of being a white, mostly conservative guy in the state of Oklahoma that had a tremendous amount of experience in life, from raising cattle to riding motorcycles to the sport of triathlon. I had a lot of boxes checked that society says need to be checked for one to have a successful life. They looked impressive, and they were impressive to some extent, but I was unfulfilled. I was living out all of these experiences that I have described, from a long, successful career in biopharma to being successful in the sport of triathlon, personally successful in the sport of triathlon at an amateur level, to buying a ranch, implementing methods that I had been certified in, raising my own cattle, riding motorcycles on the weekend. All of these things were going on with me. There was also an internal struggle that was going on between some feminine aspects of me and masculine aspects of me that I was really just starting to notice. As this journey into the unknown was beginning, I sleeved my right arm, and at the centerpiece was a stairway leading up to a beautiful gate with a beautiful sunset behind it, Heaven's Gate. It was a piece of art that had been commissioned by somebody who never had come and picked it up from my artist. It was beautiful. It is beautiful. You can look at it and see it on the cover of my book. I sit there with my sleeved arms showing. On the back side of my upper arm was John 10:9, I am the gate. Wrapping my forearms were roses leading down to a lion with its paw on the globe, and at the base of its foundation is John 18:37, I am the truth. Now that was Jesus' statement to Pilate in their conversation in his trial. Pilate responded to that statement of, I am the truth, with, what is truth? And he turned and walked away, not even waiting for the answer. And that's really interesting when you think about it, is how many times do we ask the very important questions in our own lives and then not even wait for the answer? Many times knowing that the answer could change everything. But Pilate turned and walked away. If you really want to know what somebody believes, you look at what they ink into their arms. You hope it's true and unchanging, that they've put it there. And I did. It was very much the truth. That my faith was very much a part of me and would remain unchanged and true as I would head forward. Now, my Left arm is a completely different story, inspired by a swimsuit model I had seen years ago. It was my favorite flowers, dahlias, daisies, and sunflowers, all inset into a black fishnet sleeve. This was a contentious battle with my artist. She pushed back on the black fishnet, saying that it wouldn't really look all that good. I couldn't understand why. I thought it was something against making me any more feminine than what she might see coming. But it was really just the color. She said, I'll do blue. And as we agreed that blue would be better, and I was very happy with the change, it was just very symbolic of the change that was happening inside of me. So my left arm ends up being this beautiful feminine masterpiece of a blue fishnet sleeve with my favorite flowers inserted into it, bold, vibrant, and very unmistakably feminine. And it wasn't shortly after that I, through a series of decisions that I'd made, had decided to go ahead and transition my life from that of a Harley riding, cattle ranching, gun carrying, fairly conservative guy, to that of a soon-to-be fashionista. The last couple of years I've become a award-winning speaker and a best-selling author, and now this host of this podcast. I've got this really interesting perspective. What I want to do with that is to encourage you all to look at your own stories as a series of experiences that are simply part of the journey you're on. None of those things define me. They are experiences that I've had, and I look at those experiences as giving me a tremendous amount of perspective that other people don't have. My story is very unique. Obviously, there's lots of people that have transitioned. But I'm not so sure there's a lot of people that have transitioned with those boxes checked as well. I'm in a 22-year-plus marriage. It is successful. I have a family that simply sought reassurance that the important things in life would remain unchanged, like the love of football. I had work colleagues that simply wanted to continue working together, and so they gave me a path forward, pretty much unfazed with my gender swap. And the clients were great. My clients were physicians, and they were great. They were supportive, and they were very humorous. And there was a lot of lessons learned from that. I think one of the things that I did that has made my transition successful is that I didn't know anybody that had transitioned, not a soul. Not a soul. And that really more than likely meant, and it was the case, that the people that I was around didn't really know a lot of people that had transitioned either. They just knew what they were seeing on TV or what they would hear about, or that was really the gist of their experience. And so I brought them along for the ride. I was telling my family and my parents ahead of time what was going to happen. But I did that as well with my colleagues, and then I did it with my clients. Now, I was someone that went to these offices every day and would spend time in the offices, and I knew it could be a disruptive occurrence for the Harley riding, cattle ranching to come in just all of a sudden as a woman one day. I didn't want that to happen because I did care about their business productivity and potential for water cooler talk and that kind of thing. So I invited them in ahead of time with what my plans were. And it was really fascinating how they vested in the success of my transition. I stepped out of the field and transitioned and came back and was greeted nicely upon my return. A lot of it was wondering, I'm sure, what kind of train wreck did she turn out to be? But I turned out all right, and I think people took joy in that. as I wind down this episode, I think that what I want to convey is that what I have is a perspective that from where I was at in my life to where I am now, that journey has been quite amazing. The journey has also been public, and the people around me responded positively for the most part. And as this took place almost 10 years ago, and as I wind down this podcast episode, I want to just leave you with perspective. And it's not always going to be gender. I offer a different perspective of experiences. It's not very often that you have a mostly white conservative guy that's married with a family and a fairly normal career transition his life to that of a woman's and actually turn out pretty good, if I say so myself. Now, I have a wonderful surgeon that helped me along the way too. But I offer a perspective that I want you to be very open-minded about. And my experience isn't what we've been led to believe it would be from the left or the right. A lot of times we're told that we'll be ostracized, that we should live in fear, that we won't be supported, and that we won't be welcome, but that's not my experience at all. I have a really unique experience, and I'm here to share it. That being said, I think some of the harshest pushback that I have received is from the Pride Alliance itself, is that because I don't march to the beat of a particular drum, I don't engage in identity politics and the politics of division. Sometimes that is interesting. It's an interesting perspective for myself. That the harshest criticism of me and my experiences and my response to them has been from people that seek to be themselves in a way that, in the only way they know. So I'm going to offer some different perspective than what you normally hear from somebody maybe that has transitioned. I march to the beat of my own drum. I love you guys. I'm Andrea Leigh, and this is The Andrea Leigh Show.